Many are still grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective podcast, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm your host and president of Jigsaw Queensland, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating and not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Adopt Perspective. I'm your host, Jo Sparrow, president of Jigsaw Queensland. Today I'm joined by Professor Daryl Higgins, Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies at the Australian Catholic University. He has researched child abuse impacts and prevention, family violence, and family functioning for nearly 30 years with a focus on public health approaches to keeping children safe and building child-safe organisations. Daryl is a registered psychologist and the author of more than 250 publications on child protection, out-of-home care, family law and allegations of child abuse, disability and family care, welfare reform, jobless families, past adoption and forced family separation practices, and community development approaches to child and family welfare issues. Before ACU, he was the Deputy Director of Research at the Australian Institute of Family Studies, where he co-authored the National Past Adoption Experiences Study and later led a Forced Adoption Support Services Scoping Study, and that's work that still informs service design and policy today. He's also a contributor to the landmark Australian Child Maltreatment Study. So in May this year, the Queensland Government announced an inquiry into the child safety system and linked it to the long overdue review of Queensland's adoption legislation. Prior to his election, Premier David Crisafulli called to bring back adoption as a solution to youth crime. Daryl's expertise in prevention, permanency and child-safe systems makes him uniquely placed to help us ask, what does the evidence really tell us about adoption? And is it the answer to the challenges in child protection and youth justice? And if not, what are the evidence-based alternatives? Daryl, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jo. Lovely to be with you.
I wanted to start with the current conversation in Queensland. Premier Crisafulli has suggested that adoption is the answer to youth crime, and Minister for Child Safety Amanda Cam recently reinforced that by saying the lack of adoptions in Queensland is a shocking indictment on a broken child safety system. What goes through your mind when you hear adoption framed that way?
Look, a number of things, but first and foremost, I think of the massive number of children who have been separated from parents through adoption in the past. The height of it was actually the year I was born, 1970, where almost 10,000 children that year were separated from parents. And we have to ask, was youth crime and youth justice issues completely absent when we had such high rates of removal from families, from communities, disconnection? And clearly the answer is no. And so what I worry about is, just as I also worry about how in other states, such as New South Wales, where we have had adoption from out-of-home care as a policy solution, supposedly, to the difficulties of at finding and attracting foster carers, and more importantly, of being able to invest in prevention to be able to support families to be able to remain together and to safely care for children, that we have this narrative of adoption as a solution to a problem. And in fact, I think it's just dressing up what has always been there, which is there are certain families who want to fulfill their own aspirations, which is understandable and even commendable in some ways. They want to fulfill their desire to create a family, and this is seen as a solution, and that's the problem. That we need to disentangle that desire from families to create a family, and where they might be struggling to do that via biological means, to see this as a solution to their problem and disentangle that completely.
Yeah, absolutely. From your work as Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies, what does an effective prevention first child safety system actually look like?
Yeah, well, I think it's really difficult because we have such an entrenched system that is really a kind of risk assessment and removal system, whereas in other countries, many European and Nordic countries, we have what's known as a sort of a family support model, where it's actually what we would call the statutory child protection service that's getting in really early and supporting families with a whole range of concerns, so that there's no need to come in with the kind of heavy-handed arm of the state, and do investigations and remove children because it's unsafe. So it's kind of the same agency getting in and doing that. The difficulty we have in Australia is, I think, that we have such a legacy of removal, starting, of course, with our own history of past adoption practices and our stolen generations for, First Nations families, combined with this kind of long history of growing numbers of families coming to the attention of statutory child protection authorities, and ultimately a, growing cohort of children living for most of their childhoods in out-of-home care. We have to remember that, of course, one of the biggest groups that are removed are children in infancy. And so we really need to think about what does the nature of evidence-based, prevention and early intervention supports look like. But secondarily, we need to be thinking of where can they best be placed. And I'm increasingly coming to the view that it's actually not statutory child protection departments who are best placed to do that. That, from a sort of a public health approach to prevention, it's actually other agencies, other locations that are non-stigmatizing, that are already coming in contact with families, right from the beginning, such as our, maternal and child health services. So when you go along and, have your baby vaccinated, and even starting prior to that, starting with, kind of antenatal classes, whether it's organized through hospitals or community health services. Those are the services, I don't think I've ever heard a young parent say, oh, I didn't need that support, I could have done without it. It's like, oh, wow, that was a real game changer. Perhaps it saved my life, my child's life, whether metaphorically or physically. And I need more of that. And yet we seem to not be having a conversation about that. Is any state government coming out with an election promise to say, we want to have universal, deep engagement with young families to support healthy connections between parents and children, to support delivery of evidence-based approaches to parenting, so that children can grow up safe.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, prevention rather than finding a cure.
Yes, yeah.
What does the evidence tell us about the real drivers of youth crime and the reforms that actually reduce reoffending?
Yeah, look, it's a little bit outside of my expertise, but what we know is that there's firstly a lot of overlap in terms of the children in the youth justice system and children in the out-of-home care system. And clearly one of those drivers is exposure to child maltreatment. And so, we have, I was part of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, so the first national prevalent study of all forms of abuse and neglect. And what we saw there was a really strong relationship between childhood experiences and lifetime contact with the justice system. And so that's just as true of the youth justice system. So we know that experiencing trauma, experiencing disadvantage, experiencing dislocation from family, community, and culture are very similar drivers for youth justice system involvement, just as they are for contact with the child protection system and for placement in out-of-home care.
Thank you. Back in 2012, you co-authored the Past Adoption Experiences Study at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. There it is, beautiful. Hopefully people got to see that come up on the screen then. It remains one of the most significant pieces of evidence we have. And I kind of want to say sadly, because I wish there was more coming. I really do wish there was more research into this area. But could you remind our listeners what the study uncovered about the lifelong impacts of adoption for mothers, fathers,
Yeah.
and adopted people?
Yeah, look, firstly, I want to pay credit to the Australian Government who commissioned this work when I was at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. And they did it because they were having calls, particularly from mothers, but also from adoptees and others who were saying, we need more supports and we need an apology. And so government was saying, well, what do we know about this problem? And so I and my team did a very quick, kind of literature review and kind of said, well, we really don't have evidence either about the size of the problem, nor about, its impact. So why don't you commission a study? And so that's what they did. And we were very grateful to have received the funding to do it. So it was the first, and as you say, probably at this stage, the only large scale empirical study, so getting data directly from those who are affected about their experiences of forced family separation. So we had a number of different elements to the study. We had a big survey, and so we had 1,327 participants for that survey, and it included, all of the different groups. So mothers who were separated from children by adoption, fathers who were separated from children by adoption. It was very difficult to get that group because, of course, many of them were not aware, did not know that they had been a father. So that was a much smaller group. But of course, people who'd been adopted, so adoptees, adoptive parents, and other family members. And the importance of that study was kind of twofold, to kind of show the size of the problem, like to have a self-selected sample of that magnitude, 1,300 participants, shows that there is a large group who are affected, and B, that they are wanting to talk about their experiences and willing to offer up their personal journey to be able to support better policy and service delivery to address their needs across life. But in terms of the key findings, Joe, some of the things were that we were measuring were things like anxiety and depression. We were measuring things like post-traumatic stress disorder. We were measuring engagement with health services, with psychologists, and the kind of needs that people had across life. And unfortunately, right across the board, what we saw was very high levels of distress, of mental health problems, and of difficulty accessing mainstream services. What was pleasing about it, though, was that it was such a strong evidence base that I was able to go back to government and say, here's what we're hearing. We actually have to have a better service response. And in turn, government came back and said, can you do a scoping study? Can you talk about what would the nature of services be? And so that actually led to organisations such as yours of Jigsaw being funded to offer a post-adoption support service specifically for those affected by past adoption. That ranges from those needs of how do you find out about, so finding and connecting, making contact, but all the counselling and support that needs to go around that. But quite separately from that, even if it's not actually about connecting, whether it be as a mother or as a father trying to make contact with a child from whom you are separated through adoption, it might also be for adoptees to be able to either find out about their parents, go through the process of seeking out that information and trying to make contact, or adjusting to life now for your own identity, knowing that you missed out on that opportunity to be connected to your biological parents, to your broader extended family, to your kind of cultural community, that kind of cultural legacy that so many different families have right across our beautiful multicultural Australia. So that was a really significant thing that government recognised, that it's not just about documenting the problems, but about what do we need to do to to resolve those. And of course, what was happening alongside our study was a Senate inquiry, and together those things really led to the national apology for past adoption practices, which, if anyone has got really great eyesight, can see just behind me on the wall behind here is a copy of that apology delivered by our Prime Minister.
Yeah. And I was reading it in the lead up to this interview, just sort of reminding myself of everything that was in there. And something that really stood out for me was that I think it was 54% of respondents, adoptee respondents, said that they had good experiences within their adoptive families. And 44% said that they had poor or very poor
Yeah.
experiences. And that really, stuck out to me. And it probably is what we actually see in our service as well when we're delivering our services. And a lot of people sort of approach us at first sort of saying, no, I had a good upbringing, it was safe, it was all that, and then over time when they start to explore their experience more and they feel safer, then we start to hear the reality of what that experience was. Yeah.
Yeah, and there can be a lot of resistance to actually coming to terms with those experiences that people have had. And that's the case with many different types of trauma, whether it's from abuse or neglect, or whether it's from, such as we're talking about here, separation from family. It can be very confronting, and people don't always want to face that. But we had very objective measures of well-being, and so we're able to compare with general population norms, and we found that for both mothers and fathers and for adoptees, that we found much higher rates of mental health problems and mental distress compared to normative data from the general population, which really supported our argument to say there are some unique issues that really deserve attention from government.
Such great research. So you've said before that while stability and permanency are crucial, adoption is not the answer. Why do you think governments keep returning to it as a quick fix?
Look, the short answer is I don't know. It frustrates me. It really frustrates me that government comes up with answers that are not based in evidence, that there is no theoretical or conceptual reason for trying to create these links. So that's really I think disturbing, and I think puts us on a train to potentially just simply repeating the mistakes from history, and we have to learn from history. I think many critics of the current kind of child protection system say we have all of the essential ingredients here that we had back in the stolen generation era, for which we have now as a country apologised and are still trying to make amends. And yet we seem to be repeating some of those same mistakes. And I fear that this is the same approach here, that we have what looks like a simplistic solution, but in fact, there is no evidence underpinning it to see that the answers that are being put forward match up with what the stated problem is. And as I said before, I think it also ties in with other motivations. So where governments, want to give parents who are childless and would like to complete their desire for a family another option, it seems like a great way to kind of add up, oh, we've got a problem here and we've got, something that we can improve over here. And neither of those things are backed up by the evidence. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. This is only going to make things worse. So why do they keep doing it? I think it's ignorance or willful ignorance that politicians come up with these quick platitudes that are not supported by the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, like if I just slip off my podcast hat for a second and talk about it as an adopted person who's reading these things and hearing what people are saying, it's very distressing. And I know it's distressing for a lot of people in our cohort because we've told people governments. What happened? They've apologised. In Queensland, it was the LNP government that issued the state apology, and now it's the LNP government that are saying we're going to bring back adoption as an answer. That's distressing to our population, because it's like, you don't hear us. Well, you still don't hear us. We didn't get heard in our families. We didn't get heard by government, and you're still making these mistakes.
And was the apology disingenuous? You
Yes.
know,
Yes.
that's I think where it really comes down to is how can you genuinely, I mean, that's the nature of an apology and seeking forgiveness, is that you recognize the harm that you've done and you take steps to overcome it. And so that's not just the services in place to deal with the consequences, but also the promise not to do it again. And so those things are currently at risk of being eroded, both from our, state and territories, and also as a nation. You know, how can we hold our head up as a nation who has apologised, as you can see here, for these past adoption practices when we continue to, in some ways, advocate for them?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And we are seen around the world as leaders in this. I mean, we're not often seen in Australia as a leader of much, but we're seen as a leader in this space. And now they're watching us slip backwards in this state.
Absolutely.
I also recently spoke to someone who has worked with children in out of home care, and they said to me that some children actually ask to be adopted because they want someone who can legally make decisions for them. It's very confronting for me to hear that at the time. And to me, it flagged three things. In Australia, the narrative of adoption as a happy ending is still very strong. Other long-term options may be underperforming because the supports aren't adequate, and there is a real desperation for solutions. So I've got a two-part question. What are the evidence-based alternatives that retain a child's identity and family connections? And what supports need to be in place to make sure those options succeed?
Yeah, yeah. So clearly, we still need a statutory system that can jump in when children are really unsafe. So, firstly, we need to actually go back to what our systems were designed for. And really, they were designed for very serious cases such as sexual abuse, serious physical abuse. And yet, what we have is a widening of the types of harm that are coming to the attention of child protection authorities without a widening of the solutions, the options that can be done. So, as I said, most of our argument, of our attention goes into assessing risk and not ameliorating or somehow, confronting that risk. It's either a yes or no. You get removed or you don't. Now, many would say, no, that's not the case. We refer to family support. But, I think that it's done in a piecemeal way. It's not done in an evidence-based way. It's not followed up. Often it's coming too late. So that referral to family support is after problems have already been really entrenched. So, the evidence shows that, that strong focus on risk and removal is not working. Secondly, in terms of your question about what works in terms of, providing those connections to to culture and what children need if they do have to be removed. And absolutely, I'm not what you would call an abolitionist. There are many in the US who are saying we need to abolish our statutory child protection systems. I don't go that far. I think we absolutely do need them, but they need to be a much smaller part of our safety and welfare system. So when we do need them, what we know works best is keeping children connected to family, so kinship placements, and hopefully ones that are temporary, while we do some really intense work with the biological parent or parents to be able to ensure not only continued contact, but restoration wherever that's possible. And so to be able to do that, you need to be able to get in early before those kind of problems become entrenched, those parental problems. And we know that typically they're things like parental mental ill health, parental substance misuse, broader kind of family violence. So, our services, our adult-oriented services, are often lacking. We know that there's problems across a state such as Queensland, which is so large, especially in the regional and remote areas. Those services are either hard to get to or completely absent or not culturally appropriate. So we need to fix that up. But we also have to be, referring families into those programs much earlier. And as I said, right at the beginning of this podcast, that can often happen when we have those contact points that families already have, pre-birth, at the hospital, post-birth, where those early signs of needing additional support can be picked up and provided. That's our biggest thing is at the moment we focus on assessing risk, not on delivery of tailored supports that are given at the right level of intensity depending on need.
Yeah, fantastic. So, one of the painful legacies of Australia's forced adoption era is that we now have unintentionally a national case study in what adoption does to people over a lifetime. And your research captured those voices as we spoke about earlier. What lessons do you think that policymakers must take from lived experience as they debate this adoption issue in 2025 and 26?
Yeah, look, it's a great point, Joe. I think that lived experience is really critical here. We hear from individuals, such as yourself, who speak up about your own experiences, about the clients that you work with. But our study is a study of lived experience. It's 1,300 people with different types of connections to the problem of past adoption, and so that's probably one of the most compelling voices of lived experience, that amplified voice of people coming together, showing that there is diversity. As you said at the beginning with the adoptees, that there's a certain number who say I had an okay time. But there's also a very, very significant proportion who say, I had a really difficult time. And the data on average show these higher levels of distress and mental health problems. So, we actually need to be listening to their voices. But secondly, in terms of policies, we also heard, particularly through the qualitative interviews that we conducted and the stakeholders that we engaged with around this study, we heard some really, really strong voices. And again, in other publications, I've written about that. One of the clearest messages, particularly from mothers, they were very strong about this, is that they said, never again, but we must learn from this. So they wanted the harms that had been done to them through kind of state-sanctioned separations to be fed through to current kind of policies. So the current child protection system, as we're talking about now, but also to things like donor insemination, surrogacy, etc. They saw all of these connections with these same themes about prioritizing the needs of often middle-class families to complete their desire for a family, overriding and silencing the views of those who are less fortunate, including the views of those who are not yet born and end up being born into a situation where they are disconnected from family, community, and culture.
Yeah, great points. And when governments say that they're committed to protecting a child's identity and culture, for example, through the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle, why isn't that same principle extended to all children who face separation from family?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think partly it's because the principle was developed out of the voices of our First Nations colleagues who said this is what we need. Unfortunately, I think we as a broader society are not yet tuned into learning from our First Nations brothers and sisters, and many times what they argue for and what they need is things that the rest of society would benefit from. We've got one of the longest living cultures here in Australia that we continue to ignore at our peril. And I absolutely agree. If we were able to embed those same placement principles right across our systems, I think we would have very different outcomes for our community as a whole.
Yeah, we can learn so much from them and their experience. So I know you're incredibly busy, but will you be making a submission to the inquiry or to the review? And if you had a chance to speak directly to Premier Crisafulli or Minister Cam and the decision makers who are leading Queensland's inquiry into child safety and adoption, what message would you want them to hear?
Mm. Well, I think this podcast is my submission. I would be very happy to upload it formally and make it one. My submission is that we have to learn from our mistakes. We have to not compound the problems that we have already made, but we actually have to show not only genuine contrition for those past mistakes, but our dedication to not repeating them. Secondly, we have to draw on evidence, and where we propose a solution, as preposterous in my mind as the idea of using adoption as a solution to youth justice, it's incumbent on any politician to be able to back up their arguments with good data and conceptual linkages. And unfortunately, as an expert having worked in this field for 30 years, it's completely absent. So my call to government is to rethink that and to base policy decisions upon sound scientific evidence.
Thank you so much. Professor Higgins, thank you for your time and for joining us. I do know that you're an incredibly busy man, and we really appreciate you taking that time to talk to us and bringing compassion and clarity to such an important conversation.
Thanks, Joe. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and with all of your listeners on what's a really important topic. And I've got to say, from a personal perspective, it's been a really important part of my academic journey, firstly, to have the opportunity to speak with so many people who've been harmed by the various elements of adoption throughout Australia's shameful history. But secondly, to be entrusted with their support to take their stories, whether it be through, a survey, their conversations with me, and to advocate with a collective voice for doing better for Australia and to not repeat mistakes from the past. So thank you for this opportunity to reflect on those things, and I wish everybody well.
Been a pleasure. And to our listeners, I just want to say that I know these public debates about adoption can be very distressing. So please remember you're not alone. Jigsaw Queensland, we run monthly peer support groups for adopted people, parents who lost children to adoption, and mixed groups, as well as social connection events. And of course, our forced adoption support service is available as well. And you can find all of the details on our website or our Facebook page. And if you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it, particularly with your local MP in Queensland. Leave us a review or reach out with your own story. Adopt Perspective is here to connect, inform, and give a voice to lived experience. So thank you for listening, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number, and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.